How are you? Welcome to Publick Occurances. I'm Mike Ritz. I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Rhode Island. Tonight I'll be your MC and moderator. We'll do this a little Phil Donahue style, so you'll see me down there climbing across seats and to get to your questions. It's coming. When Karen Bordelot, the previous executive editor of the Providence Journal, Nancy Cariello, the previous president of Rhode Island College, and I created Publick Occurances, we wanted to convene our community over tough and sensitive topics to prove that civil discourse still exists. Publick Occurances is named after the first multi-page newspaper in the colonies, and it was shut down after the very first issue for being too provocative. The colonial government on September 29th, 1690, issued the order that said, "The governor and council, having had the perusal of said pamphlet, and finding that therein contained reflections of a very high nature, as also sundry doubtful and uncertain reports, do hereby manifest and declare their high resentment and disallowance of said pamphlet, and order that the same be suppressed and called in, strictly forbidden any person or persons for the future to set forth anything in print, without license first obtained for those that are or shall be appointed by the government to grant the same." That's where we're coming from, right? So while the brains behind Publick Occurances have changed, you're still stuck with this face. Sorry. I'm very pleased to see that this series has continued with a strong partnership with the Providence Journal, Rhode Island College, and Leadership Rhode Island. 8 years later, we've had nearly 6,000 attendees, 17 forums, tonight's number 18, and you know what? Every single year, we've achieved civility in this room. May tonight be no exception. We've talked about tough stuff, not easy stuff. We've talked about pensions, teacher evaluations, the war on terror, Rhode Island's economy and jobs, gubernatorial debates, Obamacare, gun violence among young men, mental health system in crisis. The list goes on and on. Not easy stuff to talk about. And outside of these walls, civil discourse seems to be different. Political polarization appears to ignite a fuse that explodes with yelling and marching and protests. And what I think the founders of this would find most concerning is that there seems to be less and less listening and learning from opposing points of view. So I'm excited about the discussion, and I'm encouraged by it is sold out, so we'll see people trickle in here, the latecomers, like this guy. So, you know, this is not just of interest and concern for the country, but right here in Rhode Island. And I will tell you, among my peers, there are 800 community leadership programs across the country, representing 750,000 alumni in every state, and it is the top topic among my peers, other executive directors. Polarization, civil discourse, it is the talk. It's top of mind, and we're focusing a lot of our work around it. So the Twitter board is active, I'm to remind you. The hashtag is PolarizeRI, and we are live streaming for those who couldn't make it here tonight. So it's now my pleasure to invite President Frank Sanchez to welcome all of us to Rhode Island College.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Good evening, and welcome to Rhode Island College. We are very pleased again, of course, to be hosting Publick Occurances now in its 8th year, and I want to certainly thank the Providence Journal, Alan Rosenberg, as well as Leadership Rhode Island, Mike Ritz, for their ongoing support and leadership for certainly the last 8 years with this important series of conversations, debates, and discussions. You know, it's no secret that there is, I think some would say, a growing divide in our country when it comes to politics today. And that's why these type of deliberations are particularly important for our communities, and in particularly important for our student communities. Tonight's panel is an amazing panel. A number of Rhode Island College staff and faculty, including our chair of political science department, Dr. Michelle Brophy Berman, as well as our vice president for student success, Dr. Jason Merryweather. Collectively, of course, they will be discussing not only the reality of this polarization that we're all experiencing, but the societal costs of such hyper-partisanship. You know, the changing demographics of this state, and frankly, our student community right here at RIC, in fact, this past fall, nearly 50% of our entire freshman class will be racially and ethnically diverse this year. Because of this diversity and the growing complexity of the lives of our students, it demands that we have these type of conversations to help create a better sense of belonging, a better sense of connectedness, and I think a better sense of community, not just at Rhode Island College, but frankly, across the state, region, and nation. The issue we see play out on a national stage are also front and center on college campuses all over the country. From guns to immigration, our students are increasingly making their voices heard, both as victims and as the ones offering solutions. If we can find anything encouraging about our current climate, it is the involvement in activism on behalf of our young people. It is difficult to predict if and when America's divided culture will improve, but one thing is certain. In all of these debates, both knowledge and understanding is essential if we want to find our way through it. Our goal is for our graduates to be informed citizens, able to make decisions based on fact and on their own well-rounded experiences. In closing, I'd like to mention that this week is actually on campus. It is a diversity week, a whole series of programs and activities and speakers across campus, a week in which we celebrate our differences and offer opportunities to come together and to educate one another. We find that through these kind of conversations, what unites us is always stronger than what divides us. I hope you enjoy this evening conversation. I'm sure it will be a spirited one. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Welcoming us also tonight, and he's also a panelist this evening, which is rare. He's playing dual role, is the executive editor of the Providence Journal, Alan Rosenberg.
Thank you all for joining us here tonight, and thank you to President Sanchez and to Mike Ritz for partnering with us in this event. The Providence Journal co-sponsors this series of Publick Occurances forums as part of our vision of journalism, which involves both outlining major problems of the day and seeking their solutions. We've written extensively about the mean, nasty things candidates in this election season have said and continue to say about one another. But it's more than that. Our current national leaders savage one another over issues large and small, turning policy disagreements into accusations of treason. And our country has seen rallies and marches at which extreme rhetoric ended in acts of violence. All that has been reflected in the Journal's pages and on our website. Now we'd like to get into the reasons behind the rhetoric and try to find ways to bring people together. I'm looking forward to hearing what the rest of the panelists have to say as we explore these questions tonight. Thank you.
So before we get into the discussion, as usual, we have iClicker questions to ask you. So there's about approximately 100 of you probably that were handed these clickers. You have them, I see them in your hands. We're going to ask you questions that have a multiple choice to them, okay? So we'll get started with the first one. You'll see it on the screen. What's your favorite type of political party? Lots of fun answers here, just to get you warmed up, okay? A, costume, B, cocktail, C, holiday, D, for you Tupperware folks, and E, toga. Just to get you warmed up. So please select your best answer of the 5 there. 77 of you have answered so far. 78. Some of you are not very decisive about this tough question. I don't know how it's going to go from here.
Cocktail, holiday, that's a hard decision.
Oh, how many are in the audience?
Turn it on, Mike. I think Paul's saying they've got to turn the iClicker on if it's not on.
Bottom left. Bottom left to turn on the iClicker. Sorry about that. You got it? 80, 90, and 90. Oh, it's going up. That's what we needed. Thank you for that, Paul. 97, we got 3 holdouts they don't want to choose. They're looking for the next option. 98. All right, we're going to close the poll. Let's make Paul's job hard for him since we don't have an even 100. All right, there's your answer. All right, the next question. We're going to get a little bit more serious now, okay? You ready for this? You've got practice now. How do you describe your political outlook? A, left, C, center, B, center, C, right.
Ooh, they're fast. Let them go now.
Now look at them go.
Yeah. They've got it.
It was much easier than that toga party question, you know?
Yeah.
Some people
I
still
like
think
this, like game show.
All right, we must have 98 in the audience here. All right, lock it up. Yeah, so left and center
Well, Mike.
will be the majority here. Good luck, Mike Stenhouse.
Uphill battle again.
All right, let's go to the next. When is the most recent time you voted? A, 2018, B, 16 or 17, C, 2012 to 2015, D, before 2015, and E, never. All right, we've got very current voters in the audience, it looks like, tonight. Next question. Is political polarization good or bad for America? Number of choices. Very good, somewhat, neither good or bad, somewhat bad, very bad. Hey, we gained a voter. That's good. Somebody voted twice. You can't. You can't. Somewhat to very bad, it looks like. Is the polarization of politics in America the worst that you've ever seen?
some fast voting. I know.
Just 2 choices on this one. They're making you pick. Worse, we're talking.
We're assuming it's the same person.
Yeah,
every time,
that's
right?
true.
A, yes, and B, no. We're up to 98. What about that holdout? Where are you? Yes. I guess we picked the right topic. All right. Which of these is most to blame for the red-blue divide? Look at these choices.
Special interest me. I'm going to have to talk about it.
So that's A, the voters, B, the parties, C, special interests, and D, the media. Who are you going to place blame on? They really want to, wedge you right in there. That's not good. 97 of you, 98. Where's my holdout guy? or gal. There we go. Pressure works. I love it. Wow. So B, C, and D. That's something else there. Are you optimistic that the country's political leaders will find common ground again in your lifetime?
Depends on my lifetime. Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah?
There we go, all 90. Oh, we got 100. New voter. Look at that. Oh, a bit of a split on both sides, huh? There you go. So D, oh, they switched it off for us. Flip back so people can see. The choices, sorry. Because we're looking at B and D. D being the most. There we go. Somewhat pessimistic. All right, that gets us going. We will be asking you a couple of questions at the end of tonight as well. So be prepared for that. Don't lose your eye clickers. Don't take them home if you run out the door. They're precious around this place. And let's get started, shall we? So you have folks' bios, and I'll just reintroduce them to you with the first question by their title. And we're going to start over here with Georgia Isman, Rhode Island Working Families Party State Director, with the question, where are you? There you are, Georgia. With the question, well, we've been hearing, we heard it tonight, polarization is bad and hurts unity in our country, but many politicians and political operatives seem to say it's key to winning elections. So is competition driving the wedge?
Honestly, I think elections function in both directions. For many years, I've certainly been told in my life in politics that the way to win an election is to move closer to the center and say that your position is actually very close to your opponents, and there isn't actually that much difference, and voters shouldn't be too worried about you. You know, you're not too extreme. That is a real political pressure that exists and is created by, especially by two candidate elections with one Democrat and one Republican in them. I think increasingly I see and have seen for a long time that what really matters is being able to lay out a clear vision for voters, and that sometimes means a vision that's pretty divergent from what the other candidate is putting out there in the world. And I do think we have this moment in this country where voters are hungry for a real vivid, bold vision of what you want government to be like, and they are responding to those. You saw that with Bernie Sanders, you see that with, to some extent, I think you could say you even see that with Donald Trump, although it's a very different vision, right? That people are responding in this moment to bold, articulated visions of what our government and what our country could be like. So I actually think political pressures work in both directions, and it depends.
Yeah. What do you think? Mike Stenhouse is the founder of the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity. What do you think, Mike?
Well, first, being in the minority, can I try to get some unity and say, go Red Sox? Can we agree on that? All right, thank you.
He just lost all the Yankees fans.
I know there's a few around. Polarization implies extreme views, but I think division of thought is good. It's what our country is about. We believe in a rigorous but civil debate. You know, we're a research and advocacy organization. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having differing views of how the vision Georgia mentioned should work. But I think right now that the vision between the left and the right is as wide as I could ever imagine it being. And I'm not a great historian of American history, but you know, right now we've got two really polarized views of how our government should work. Those of us who believe in constitutional principles, that we just want to be left alone and live our lives as best we can, and we can fail or we can succeed, we can get up and we can try again. Lord knows I struck out enough times in baseball, but the spirit of it is you get up and you go to bat again, right? That's the American spirit. But we have another point of view that believes that you should be dependent on government. And that's the better way, that the government should control our lives, tell us how to run our businesses, tell us how to live our lives. And so I can't imagine there can be two different views of government. I don't think those views were that broad 50 or 100 or 200 years ago, maybe save the slavery question, which obviously was a big issue. So I think division and of thought and polarization is okay. It's healthy as long as we engage in civil debate over that, and I think that's probably what we'll get to next.
Thank you very much. You know, we're lucky. We've got Ted Nesi here, a political and economic reporter from Channel 12, WPRI, slid in under the radar here as we're getting started, blaming 95, I know. And Alan Rosenberg, executive editor of Projo. I'm going to throw you guys the same question. Be curious to hear what you have to say about this. In fact, Mike Stenhouse sent out an email saying that media is part of the problem. And a lot of people say that the media is heightening polarization across America, and that you need attention. You've got to get clicks to stories. You're more sensational than you've been. What do you have to say about that criticism?
Alan or me?
Yeah, we'll start with you, Ted.
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. I appreciate it. And I think this, events like this can maybe push against some of the things we're talking about, lack of civility, et cetera, to have different viewpoints on stage. I do think changes in the media are part of what's led to the level of polarization we have today. I always struggle when people say the media. I've never been invited to a meeting of the media where we get our marching orders and we all, like Channel 10 and Channel 12 do not talk to each other in the morning about what will be on them. We try to find something that won't be on the other station, right? Alan, I wish he'd call me with what Kathy's working on, but she doesn't.
Never.
Never, exactly. So I think, the media, sometimes I have a feeling as a local reporter who's stayed at the state level that we often see in polls that people hate Congress but like their local congressperson. Sometimes I feel there's some of that with the media. Being on TV, whether it's me or Tim White or someone, people see us in the market or at the gas station and they're like, oh, you're on Channel 12. And people are unfailingly usually nice. They'll say, thanks for trying to get the truth. And so I think some of it's when the media is very far away, national outlets, I think 24-hour news, is very different. If I needed to have a hot take every 20 minutes on the governor's race because we were on 24 hours a day on Channel 12, my job would be very different. There'd probably be just a pressure to stay interesting, which might push you into more extreme comments and such. Whereas, to the extent that we still are doing, yes, we're filing stories to the web all day, but we are generally still doing stories, news stories, and I think that cuts a little against some of what you see in the national media. Then also, you have to include social media, which is not, the classic, the media, the establishment media. That's bubbling up from people. I'm often, frankly, taken aback by some of what I see in just the comments on our own stories. Just how, I wonder, do you have a mother? Has she seen you talk like this? The way people are, and I just wonder if would anyone say some of the things they'll say in a Facebook comment about a public figure or even about a non-public figure who happens to be in the news? Would you say that to their face? And if not, what's it doing to our discourse that there's now this outlet where you can just spew really nasty stuff that in person you would probably almost never do that kind of thing? That troubles me.
Yeah. Alan, today I saw a senator in Rhode Island made a comment about the cartoon he ran in the Providence Journal, saying it is polarizing, and how could you, sit on the stage and talk about polarization in a negative way when the journal's putting out this kind of material? Could you explain what are these cartoons and, in general, some of the other things around editorials and stuff? I think sometimes people don't understand them entirely.
Sure. When I was growing up in Chicago, we had 4 newspapers every day, and 2 of them were liberal, the Sun-Times and the Daily News, owned by the Field newspaper group, and 2 of them were conservative, the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Today, owned by the same company. And so you could have your choice. I'm a liberal, I'm going to read these papers. I'm a conservative, I'm going to read these papers. That's not the world we have today in Rhode Island. We're the only statewide newspaper. And we feel that it's important that we reflect views from across the spectrum and let people hear, and people hate this today, hear the other side, hear a view they might not agree with, hear a view that might challenge their point of view, sometimes in a really forceful way. People don't they love it when it's their side being put forward in a forceful way. They're not so wild about it when it's the other side being put forward in a forceful way. So we've got conservative cartoonists that we've added in the last couple of years because all of the cartoonists that we were carrying from various services hated Donald Trump. And while a lot of people in Rhode Island might also hate Donald Trump, he did win a lot of towns. There are a lot of people in Rhode Island who voted for Donald Trump. And similarly, we added a columnist who will show you the positive side of Donald Trump, where our previous columnists were mostly, not all, but mostly, very vocal against him. So we're hoping that we can let people see, here's a different view from yours. You already know what you think. You already know what your friends think, because you've unfriended or muted everyone on Facebook who disagreed with you.
Come on, you know you did it.
And so here comes the Providence Journal to say, there is another point of view. And you might not like it, but you ought to be aware of it.
How do you find that balance? You know, if you're showing one point of view and you're showing the other point of view, do you literally tick, tick, tick counting these things? How do you drive that sort of straight down the road?
So I'm not picking them myself. So
Yeah.
I don't have the inside, is there a counter? I don't think there's a counter. But I think that Ed Acorn, who edits our editorial pages, is aware, because we discussed it in the editorial board, that we want to make sure that we hear pros and cons on local issues, that we hear different opinions on local and national issues, and that over time, all points of view are represented, so that people don't look at the paper and never find anything that reflects themselves. But I don't think there's a counter.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. Speaking of you all muting the other opinion and how sort of we're behaving as voters, Mark Dunkelman is the author of a book that, if you haven't read it, you might want to consider it, called The Vanishing Neighbor. And it was really, pardon?
Definitely buy it. I don't care if you read it, but
He pays me later. In essence, he was trying to answer this question, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, why is Washington stagnant? Why aren't things happening? Why isn't common ground happening? And I just let him tell you a little bit about why he thinks that is, what the conclusion of this exploration has been for him.
Yeah, well, terrific questions and some terrific feedback already. The core question that I wanted to understand, I was living in Washington in the time, was why polarization was happening in Washington, why there were fewer compromises. And it seemed to me that the traditional explanations that we all read about, sometimes in the Providence Journal or in the New York Times or the Washington Post, wherever it is, that there's too much money in politics, that the politicians are all out for donations, that gerrymandering's a problem, where voters pick districts rather than the districts picking the elected representative, that there's the filibuster. There are a whole series of common explanations, and I realized at a certain point that all of those explanations are old hat, in the sense that gerrymandering is named after James Madison's vice president, right? The filibuster rules haven't really changed substantively since the 70s. There's always been money in politics. There have always been lobbyists. So what changed? And the conclusion that I came to was that something's changed in our own lives. All of us in this room. That we are spending more time talking to the people we love most. So if you think of all the people that you know and spend time with, you're spending more time with the people that you love most, who are your spouses, your children, your parents, your best friends. We're spending more time talking to people who share some single common interest. So I was born in Cincinnati, and I am one of 17 Cincinnati Bengals fans in the whole world.
Come on, there's got to be one in here. No, sorry.
Yeah, Try the clickers on that, Mike. And we all know each other because we're all interacting, but I don't know anything else about those people. But the relationships that we have with people who live in our neighborhood, who bowl with us in a league, who go to the PTA, who attend meetings like this that we know well enough to be able to say something to that's sort of more important or more thoughtful than what's going on with the weather. I hear your mom fell. Is she doing okay? I hear your son's struggling in math class. Has he figured that out? But those sorts of relations have dissipated. And in the absence of having conversations like that, that's where you talk to people, someone you trusted who had a different political opinion, right? That's where you had a conversation with someone who explained, this is why I voted for Hillary Clinton, even though you're a Trump voter or the other way around. And in that sort of, that everyday conversation that you have in line at the coffee shop or while you're getting a donut waiting for the PTA meeting to start, that's where you begin to see the other side as reasonable, as having a legitimate point of view and a legitimate concern. And in the absence of those conversations, you're more likely to believe my side is right, those people are wackadoodle. We need to fight all the time, and that's where you get polarization. So just sort of to sum up, the change is in the fabric of our everyday lives, and that is spreading into our experience and the way we understand politics.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Pearson-Merkowitz conducted a study on the history of polarization and has also been a political insider herself on campaigns locally and at the state level. So Mark's saying this is the way things are now. Has it always been this politically polarized? You know, if we look at, say, late 18th, early 19th centuries, do we find that to be true?
Yeah, so I'll disagree with Mark. So I think...
Now we're going.
You know, we're certainly at a blip, but we've had lots of blips, so I will turn that question around. Are we more polarized today than when the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists wrote their papers and we almost didn't have a constitution? This country almost fell apart. Are we more polarized today than during the Civil War? Are we more polarized today than when Brown versus Board of Education was decided, and several states decided that instead of integrating schools, they would simply not have public schools anymore, and the president had to send troops to let an African-American girl into her public school? Are we any more polarized today than during the Vietnam War? I don't think so. And looking at the numbers, I would say this is something that ebbs and flows in the United States when we have big questions in front of us, when we have political figures who are giving us big choices, their views of America, instead of coming to what, honestly, a moderate middle that doesn't make any sense. If anybody can remember 1,000 Points of Light, I'm not sure what that was. It's not very polarizing, but I don't know what it means, right? So I would say that in this moment, are we more polarized today than 10 years ago? Well, it would appear to be, or 12 years ago. But is this abnormal for the United States? I would say no. And I would also say, this is where I'm going to disagree with Mark, I don't think we're any more politically segregated than we ever have been. If anybody remembers the Martin Luther King quote saying, the most segregated time in America is 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, we've always hung out with people who believe the same thing we believe. We've always hung out in social groups of like-minded people, and I don't remember a time when people got together and sat down and listened to each other. You know, there's always been this unspoken rule, or spoken many times in the United States, which is there are 3 things you don't talk about at the dinner table, right? And one of them is politics. And that's not a new statement, right? That is a really old thing, that you don't talk about politics at Thanksgiving, right? Because you might have to talk to someone who disagrees with you. And, you know, during major times in the United States, whether it was the Vietnam War, whether or not it was desegregation, whether or not it was the founding Constitution, we've seen fights, we've seen protests, we've seen people refusing to talk to each other. And we get through it. Right? Eventually, and I will say this is where we do go back to those founding moments, right? The founding fathers had to come together and find some compromise or the country was gonna fall apart. Same thing was true during the Civil War. Now, we went to war that time. We're not there yet, right? So looking historically, we've been able to get through these things and progress as a country as a result of a high level of debate, a high level of conflict, a high level of airing of what people really think. So my answer is rather nuanced, but I would certainly say, even looking at congressional polarization, we are no more polarized today than we have been at many times in history, and we do seem to get through it.
It's optimistic here. It's optimistic. Dr. Brophy Berman, Rhode Island College chairwoman of Political Science Department, and she's teaching a class this semester on the benefits of civic agreement and the costs of polarization. So what have you found so far?
Well, the class is really just called political behavior.
Ah.
And so I taught it last time about 6 years ago, and at that time, polarization was something that people were talking about. But when I went to revise my syllabus and think about it for this semester, everything out there is polarization, polarization, polarization. And so that's something that I started the semester with, asking students, what do you think about this particular question, or do we need to be concerned? And that's kind of the trip that we're taking throughout the semester. But I think for my students, I wanted to make sure they understood the definition of the term polarization, because it's been used in a lot of different ways. Oftentimes when you think of polarization, you think of people, the Republicans and Democrats, having extreme issue positions. So they're going this way, right? And what's interesting is that when you look at the political science literature, you have real disagreement. They're actually polarized within the political science literature about what's happening. So you have those who say basically it's the elites who are polarized, Congress is polarized, and that's really, only the elites and the most politically active in the parties are really polarized. You have other scholars who say, no, the entire electorate is polarized because we're becoming more ideological. And that's true, more of us today are ideological, or I should say we correctly label ourselves. We call ourselves conservative and we join the Republican Party. We call ourselves Democrat and we join the Democratic Party. About 20% of us today have consistent attitudes. So if we're conservative on a bunch of different policies. I keep hitting that. And if we're liberal on all of those different policies. That's up from 10% 20 years ago. So even still, I think, when you think about 20% of us are extremely ideological, have a consistent set of opinions, that other school, or I should say, that we don't really have that, the consistency issue, since we're so, since we are ideologically more consistent than we have been in the past, I think, excuse me, I lost my train of thought. I think it's important to understand that most people aren't, most people aren't really polarized. And in fact, we're not very polarized on issues. We're much more, polarized on other types of things. It's not so much issues. It's more our identities.
Thank you. I'm asking one question around the panelists here, and then I'm coming out there. So I know you've got questions. I just want to, give you a chance to think about it. We want good ones, on the panel, and new to the panel tonight, Dr. Merryweather is Vice President of Student Success. Basically, if it's student affairs at Rhode Island College, he sees it. There's a long list, right? And not just here. Dr. Merryweather has been in Kentucky, from my home state of Indiana, fellow Hoosier, and it feels differently. And so one of the things I'm interested in is that at the school campuses, people get pretty excited. We've seen at the national level, students get pretty riled up about guest speakers. They protest, they burn things in some cases. Berkeley, Brown University, we closed down chief of police from speaking at one point. The list sort of goes on. And you not only have your experience as student success, but you're a member of the Directorate for the Commission for Student Conduct and Legal Issues at American College Personnel Association. How do you manage this on these campuses? Because it seems quite common.
Very good. I'm from Kentucky, so I handle that by praying a lot. Wow. So in reality, it's fascinating because I think what we've shifted from, I remember when I was in college at the University of Louisville, one of my professors, Dr. Ricky Jones, said in the first day of class, your job is not to agree with anything, but your job is always to understand, certainly if you want to pass one of my tests. And I think that is the shift that we've seen, especially around students, is there really isn't discourse around understanding an idea. So I did debate, and one of the cool things about debate was learning and hearing everything someone said, understanding it as well as you could, just so you could go back and argue. We've sort of shifted away from that concept of understanding and really seek agreement, and we begin to see that sort of proliferate the student body. So I did a little homework and found 39 cases of commencement speakers who were disinvited from college campuses. To name a few, Condoleezza Rice was disinvited from Rutgers University by parties from the left because of disagreement with her political views and positions. Texas Southern University, parties from the left disinvited Senator John Cronin based on history of racial issues. This is a fun one. George W. Bush was disinvited from the University of Arizona from parties from the right because they were upset about his tactics to defeat John McCain in the Republican primary. Morehouse College, an HBCU in Atlanta, disinvited Sacramento Mayor Kevin Johnson from the left because they didn't agree with his political views. It's just fascinating hearing some of that, but where did the point go where we say, wow, college is the place to make mistakes. College is the place to hear other points of view and to learn from them, even if at the end we're not going to agree. And I think that's what you see with some of those disinvitations around graduation. And when we speak with students, our job isn't to shift them into our points of view, but to get them to acknowledge many points of view so as to come to their own conclusions. Even if they further their points of view, or even if they're shifted a bit, it's really our job to help students come to a place where they've collected as much information as possible. And what concerns me is the collection of information has begun to dissipate a bit. Ted, you talked earlier about that whole concept of social media. So what you talked about is this term I call digital courage. The rappers call it Twitter fingers. And in reality, that's what we see is you can meet someone and you can attack them, having never met them, based off a soundbite, without any context or appreciation for nuance. And part of our work is to get students to slow down and to ask questions and to challenge, but the question asking and the challenging has been replaced with assumption. And so that's why you see some of these trends on campus, because people simply don't want to hear points of view. Give me a speaker with a different point of view. I'm glad to listen to them and hear from them, even if it gives me something to ask them a really snarky question.
Getting some applause here. Let me give you time for applause. Okay, question from the audience. Yes, ma'am. Please stand up and let us know who you are and ask your question. I'll hold the microphone, okay?
Hi, good evening. My name is Marcia Liss, and I have, thank you. Okay. There are just a couple of things that I'd like to kind of point out. I'm a psychologist in the community, and I have to tell you that the amount of anxiety that is coming into my consulting room is noteworthy. I've been doing this for almost 30 years, and it's the questions about how much news do I watch, when do I turn it off, when do I not turn it off, when can I affect change, when can I not affect change. When I was a doctoral student, I volunteered for one of the sides of the aisle in the abortion question, and I'm not going to tell you which one. But what I learned from that is I watched the other side, and I learned that they believe just as much in their point of view as I believe in mine. And they were pretty civil about it too. I didn't agree with everything that they said. I certainly didn't agree with what they were doing, but it really got me to thinking. And I find that what concerns me is that the moderation of our candidates is almost, it gets squeezed out through the campaign. Like I watched Mitt Romney. who went from a moderate Republican to all of a sudden this way. And I'm like, wait, that, he was in Massachusetts. Like, give it a break.
Ma'am, what's your question?
I would like you to comment about that, about the anxiety, and about this kind of, it seems like the moderation gets squeezed out of when people run for office, and it gets lost.
Yeah, Mike, you've got something to say?
So one thing I've noticed that might contribute, by the way, we have a board member who's a psychiatrist who mentions the same thing. He said, boy, business has been really good lately. And we have these derangement syndromes, whether it's Bush, Obama, Trump, right? They're out there and apparently they're real. And part of that is I think it's the intolerance of allowing the other team, and I'm going to use baseball analogies, to score a run. You know, in baseball there's 9 innings, and sometimes the team scores a run in the first, and the other team scores a run in the third. But it seems like too many people today don't want to ever allow the other team to score a run. You know, it's a 9-inning game. It's a long season. The other team's going to make a few points or score a few runs, or society might agree with them. But we have this intolerance to give an inch. I don't know where it comes from. You're the psychologist. But just take the baseball attitude. It's a 9-inning game. It's a 162-game season. The other team's going to win some games, score some runs. Accept it. But you have a chance to make your case and win in the end. I don't know where it comes from, but I've noticed that, you know, it's the equivalent of arguing with the umpire on every single play, or calling for instant replay, or protesting the game. I mean, on every single play, there seems like there's somebody ready to, sue or, bring it to a court or whatever. I don't know where it comes from, but it's there, and I agree with you.
Georgia, isn't this good politics, right? Getting reaction, getting people passionate, fired up. Isn't that good politics? Isn't that how you win elections?
I don't really think elections are won by the sort of angry Twitter wars online. I think someone, I forget which one of you said a smart thing about maybe the polarization is really among political elites and among members of Congress and people who are politicians, and certainly we see a lot of disagreement there. Look, in our work, we work on issues that are somewhat controversial at the State House, like a $15 an hour minimum wage. We worked on a paid sick days campaign last year. And those issues are not actually controversial among ordinary people. They're not actually controversial among voters for the most part. They are widely supported. They are controversial at the State House, and they're controversial in the pages of the Projo and in other media sources. But when the way we do our work is by going out into the community and talking to people one-on-one, and maybe this does, overcome some of the people are missing some ability to talk to their people in the cappuccino line. But when you actually talk to people about issues, we find that there's actually pretty broad agreement and engagement on a lot of the issues. So I think in some ways the polarization is a product of it doesn't seep all the way down into where people actually fall and what they actually think in terms of issues and in how they want to live in community with one another.
Ted, do you find that drama plays out in debates? You're involved in a lot of political debates.
We've done them in here, actually, yeah.
Yeah. There's one coming here, I heard. Are you finding that it's getting increasingly less civil at debates, or is it the same as always?
Now when Tim White moderates, he keeps them in line. I think, I was thinking about what Georgia said, and I do sometimes think that, again, maybe it's the noise of social media, maybe it's just because the loudest voice gets the most attention, but when I even think just about our election in Rhode Island this year, if you judged off my Twitter feed how Governor Raimondo was going to do in the Democratic primary, you would have thought she was toast, because I heard a lot more from Matt Brown people who were very energized, very excited, very, very critical of the governor. And I admit, after, especially with no public polling, I was like, is there like a real uprising to change who the Democratic nominee is? And then the governor won 24-point victory, something like that night, which is not to disparage Matt Brown's supporters, but just to say, in the end, if you had missed the campaign, you'd say, oh, okay, generally in the Rhode Island's Democratic primary electorate, there was a general consensus, we'll stick with the current governor. And so I think, that's an example that cuts against this argument that there's this, uprising happening, throwing out more moderate Democratic candidates that you've seen some people suggest. There have been examples, but I do think it's easy to look only at the most interesting examples, which are usually upsets, and miss all the times that a more bland politician actually does get a lot of support. Going out to Rhode Island the week before our primary, Tom Carper, the very low-key Democratic U.S. Senator from Delaware, had a very impassioned challenge from the left, and he won like 60+% of the vote in his primary. So I think again, you see the voters come out, a little as George has said, the voters aren't always as polarized, as ideologically, diffused as I think sometimes we think from the public discussion. And maybe it is because the media, incumbent governor likely to win primary for renomination is not as exciting as saying, is incumbent governor in trouble? I wouldn't argue that as a reporter, but maybe that can mislead us about where the voters actually are on the ground.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. I'm Paul Rosselli. My perspective is in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Talk about a tumultuous time, everything from assassinations to president resigning. I want to go back to something that both Ms. Pearson-Merkowitz and perhaps Mark had talked about, and that is that we got through it. How did we get through it? What was the impetus? Who started it off? And once the firecracker was lit, how did it end?
So, I'll jump in, and I'd love to hear from you. So, a lot of the things in which we have gotten through these in the past are due to what we, in political science, call a realignment, which is the voters decide which side they're on and which side they're going to support. Coming out of the, 1960s, coming out, a lot of these times, there's a shift where the voters go towards one party and say, this is the direction we want the country to go in, and the other party has to figure out how to win a coalition back, right? How to win those voters back, and that can cause a shift going in either direction. We've seen it throughout history. It goes to the left, it goes to the right, but it usually causes things to calm down, right? So, and compromise generally happens at the brink of disaster, right? So I said this last year, I got some reporter call, and they said, what's going to bring us together as a country? And I said, I hate to say it, but it's going to be possibly a huge disaster, right? It's something that causes us to all go, that stuff doesn't matter, let's come together, right? Or if we can't figure this out, right, the debt ceiling has been a way that we've come together, right? The fiscal cliffs, where Congress goes, literally we can't function tomorrow if we can't figure something out. We see compromise in those moments, we see shifts. Right, so I would say there's a couple ways where we come through these things. We come through them because the country decides to come together and get over things because of, generally, it's some sort of disaster, unfortunately. Or that we can't function anymore, and the voters decide, right? The voters make a push to one side, which allows one political party, whichever political party that is, to govern for a little while and lets the other political party know it is in such a small minority that it has to change positions in order to recapture that swingable section of the electorate. And so, we've seen periods in our nation's history where both parties were in a severe minority, and that was generally after a big polarizing moment. But it causes that fission that says this party took the wrong stance, this party took the right stance, the voters support it, and now the other party has to figure out how to compete again. And generally that is, by what I liked what Georgia said, right, by trying to everybody move into the middle and trying to argue over those voters who could actually swing.
Do you have anything to add, Dr. Brophy Berman? Do you have anything to add?
Oh, sorry.
I know I hide around. I'm like whack-a-mole out here. This is how I do it. Yeah.
I was not expecting that. I think that I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I think that there was actually a New York Times opinion piece today by Thomas Friedman. I don't know if anybody saw it. And in it was called The American Civil War Part 2. And in it he quotes Senator Jeff Flake, the Republican from Arizona who is retiring. And Jeff Flake said, "Tribalism is ruining us. It is tearing our country apart." And although, Friedman does take some jabs at the Republican Party, so if you're a Republican, you may not want to read that editorial, I think he makes some really good points about tribalism. And I think even though we know that Americans aren't really polarized in the sense that their issue positions are really severe and extreme, I think we are more tribal, right? This is sometimes referred to as social polarization, and this semester I had my students read a book about this idea of social polarization, where it used to be that the political parties in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were a lot of cross pressures, so that you would have the Democratic Party had almost as many Protestants in it as did the Republican Party, right? Religion was not, today if you look at religion, pretty much, if you look at that as a factor, the Republican Party has become the party of religiosity, which is more, I don't want to call it extreme religion, but people going to church more often, people who look at the Bible as the literal word of God. Today our parties are totally separate. You have the Democratic Party that has become largely minority, black, and Latinos and minority, and it's also become very secular, right? And it's also become very liberal. And the Republican Party has done the opposite. It's become much whiter, much more religious. Think about the 90s and what was going on with the Christian coalition. And it's become much more conservative. And so what happens, what scares me, and this is not my theory, this is a great book that I'm having my students read, the professor who wrote it, Liliana Mason, just came out. She's really looking at it from a social psychological standpoint, and she's talking about how we've gotten into these separate groups, and we really don't like each other. And even though our policies are not diverging, our dislike of each other, our fear of each other, our wanting to win at any cost is a problem. And that's what I think I'm seeing. We're seeing that more often, more than in the past. Not totally, obviously, not in the past forever, but in recent years, we're definitely seeing that. And there's a whole host of factors that are involved there. But I think that's what I'm most worried about.
Mark, it sounds like if we don't like each other, it's going to be hard to talk to our neighbors. It's going to be hard to talk in these lines when we're waiting for something. Do you agree with this premise?
Well, I'd probably put the cart before the horse the other way, right? That if you have had fewer conversations with your neighbors, who are people you trust and have had a reasonable time borrowing a cup of sugar from, and they introduce you to the sense that they voted for the other candidate and they've got these concerns, that opens you up to the possibility that you'd like your representative to work with someone who represents your neighbor's point of view when they get to Washington or to the State House, wherever it is. There is sort of this interesting divide that I didn't expect on the panel, which is, are we polarized or not? And frankly, it never occurred to me that someone would come up and say that we aren't, which is, it's sort of eye-opening. It's sort of a neighborly thing to have happen. I think there is an important distinction here, which is that, in the 50s, the American Political Science Association, which I assume my two peers on the panel are part of, came out with a big report arguing that there wasn't enough of a divide between the two parties, that they were essentially reflecting one another too much so that voters didn't have a choice. Does anyone think that's a problem today? The upshot of that is that while even during these periods where there was a lot of tumult in the country about civil rights and the Vietnam War and Watergate and through all of that, there were substantive compromises coming out of Washington. Everett Dirksen working across the aisle with Mike Mansfield, Tip O'Neill working across the aisle with Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton working across the aisle with Newt Gingrich. We haven't seen compromises like that in a long time. Something has changed. And I think You can argue whether whether we've gotten through these times before. I think there's a qualitative difference there that's emerged over the course of the last few years. I think it's exactly along the lines of a social divide between people who have different points of view. I think there's a lot of data to back this up in a variety of ways. There's a book that came out 10 years ago that pointed out that in 1976, about a third of counties in the United States voted overwhelmingly by a 20-point margin for either Jerry Ford or Jimmy Carter. So about 1 out of 3. By the time we got to the 2004 election, about 2 out of 3. So it was up to about 60% of counties that voted overwhelmingly for one or the other. We're having fewer interactions face-to-face, not online. We're having more interactions online between people who disagree. We're having fewer face-to-face interactions with people we will see again and need to maintain a cordial relationship with. And that is changing the way we view politics. It's changing our impetus. It makes us more likely to be, to the psychologist's point of view, anxious because it seems like there are people living among us or living a few neighborhoods away who really see the world in a totally different way, in a way we find totally offensive. We don't understand where they're coming from. It is nerve-wracking, and that is compelling us to give different operating instructions to our representatives in Congress, which is to go to Washington, fight, fight, fight. If you don't fight, we will primary you out. And in that sort of circumstance, you're going to get fewer sort of grand compromises or legislation that reflects the sensibilities that Georgia and Mike represent.
Yeah, Mark, there's a geographic divide too. I remember you mentioning to me a book called The Big Sort and how people move and where they choose to live and how that creates separations. So knowing your neighbor, in that case, might be a little bit more homogenous. Then how do we know, if we're in urban Providence, how do we know west of 102? Those of you that remember the Providence Journal map of the presidential election, there was a divide shown right through the Strait of Rhode Island, where inland was red in Rhode Island and the coastal area was blue. I remember it very well. Will you explain that concept of the big sort and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was trying to allude to before, this idea that we are, that if you're moving and you're a liberal and you see a place where there's Whole Foods, you're home. If you're a conservative and you're in a neighborhood and you see a Cracker Barrel, you're home, right? And that gets to the social sorting that Dr. Brophy Berman is talking about, that there is that distinction. What's interesting, this is an important nuance, is that even in these counties that voted overwhelmingly for either George W. Bush or John Kerry or for Jimmy Carter or Jerry Ford, that you can have a county that voted overwhelmingly 60-40 and 2 out of 5 voters basically voted for the other candidate. So I live in a part of Providence that is overwhelmingly Democratic, voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. And I assumed that almost everyone on my street voted that way. But the day before the election, as I was driving to the polls, I saw on my street 2 Trump signs. Right there in a fairly wealthy, well-to-do part of Providence. And I suspect that if you go to more conservative places that are further from the water in Rhode Island, that there were Clinton voters there, even if they voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And the interesting thing is, I think the change is not how we've sorted generally, but the fact is that I didn't know the neighbor on my own street who voted for Donald Trump. And I suspect that there are a lot of people who are living in Trump country who don't know their neighbor who voted for Hillary Clinton. And that the most powerful thing we could do to get people to change the way Washington works and make it so that people are more inclined to reach across the aisle and do deals that are in the broad public interest and touch on the various disagreements. You mentioned that Georgia, that people generally agree on many of these things, but we're not making a lot of progress on any of the issues, left or right. But there are places where I bet Mike and Georgia agree, and we're not getting those compromises done because the polarized environment in Washington, driven by our own operating instructions we're handing to candidates who are supposed to fight rather than compromise.
Well, I don't know about that. I heard that Georgia and Mike were going to a Cracker Barrel next week for lunch. Then we're going over to Whole Foods. They have good pizza. We've got a question from the audience. Yes, ma'am. Stand up, please.
Hello. My name's Lucille Denaro. I'm a political science student at Rhode Island College. Something that was interesting to me, Ms. Isman and Mr. Nessie, you mentioned how, people are looking for someone they're hungry for someone with a bold vision, or, 24-hour news, you need to keep making the story interesting, keep it hot, keep it fresh. And something that we learn about in political science is, demagoguery. People look for someone with a big, bold idea to stand behind. But something that interests me is Vietnam also keeps getting brought up tonight. So I just want to know, would you say that people are more apt to get behind a person than a movement? And if so, why?
I'll let you go first.
I think it's both. Look, I do a lot of work with candidates for state and local office, and who you are matters a lot. It's not just what issues you stand for, it's how credibly you can show that you've been engaged in your community and worked hard on those issues and been committed to making the neighborhood a better place. And in a lot of local elections, sometimes the issues are not even really left-right issues. They're different than that, although there are still dividing issues in communities, for sure. So candidates matter a tremendous amount. And the kinds of people who are willing to step forward and be a candidate and put a vision out there makes a tremendous difference. And, I actually think one of the good things that is happening in this political moment is that we see lots of people, more people of color, more women stepping up and running for office and offering both bold and frankly somewhat different than we've heard before visions of what government should be like and how we should live together in our communities. So candidates matter a tremendous amount. Issues matter too. You can be the nicest person in the world and great at talking to your neighbors, but if you're walking around asking them to support you on a platform that's very different from the way that they want to see their local or state government run, you're going to have a hard time. So it's both. I don't know, that's maybe not a super satisfying answer to your question, but it's what I know to be true.
I also think, polarization, again, we're talking about such a huge concept that can cover so much. I just keep thinking of counterexamples, and I think it also depends on the time frame you're looking at. So obviously for an election, candidate matters a lot. I've seen many times candidate quality makes a big difference. The same two different candidates spouting the same things, if one of them is just a better persona, they'll probably have a better time of it. But I've also seen where this sort of slow work of movement building, building a sort of an agreement among the populace on an issue can make a change. And the one that comes to mind is same-sex marriage, where when I became a reporter, I think it was still only minority support for same-sex marriage. And even when I was first covering the Rhode Island State House, some of us thought it would be many, many years before same-sex marriage was legalized for various reasons. A lot of lawmakers didn't feel their constituents were there yet. And I remember that the folks who pushed that successfully in the end, they said that what actually worked for them was doing a lot of door knocking, where gay couples would go to their neighbors, to Mark's point, and say, hey, we're not that different, and we just want to be able to get married like you and your wife are with your children, and it bubbled up. I firmly believe there's an old saying that politics is downstream from culture. And I do believe that was an example where the politicians actually ended up a step maybe behind their constituents, and they started to find, oh, they're more comfortable with this than I thought, and there was a vote. So that's just one example, but I think, that stuff that happens over the course of multiple elections, and it's work being done by groups that want to change how issues are perceived, how people feel, and they're almost working underground for a while, and then eventually you see it come out in an election.
Can I chime in there, just because I think it's a terrific example. I do think that there's been insufficient focus in the media
It's always
of the distinction that how can we have legalized same-sex marriage, and then 2 years later elected Donald Trump? That's a remarkable shift. I think the distinction is the reason that same-sex marriage is sort of this anomaly in the sense that we move so quickly on it as a country is that lots of people know people in the LGBT community. It is spread across all sorts of different communities. And when you compare that to an issue like immigration, where the immigrants are in many cases sequestered or foreign or distant, you look at the counties that voted most overwhelmingly on the issue of immigration around the country, there are places where there aren't that many immigrants. That's a really crucial distinction, so that the everyday experience of having known someone in your office or someone on your street or someone, you have some relationship with someone who is from the LGBT community, and you say to yourself, why shouldn't they have the same opportunities that I do if you're assuming you're not in the LGBT community yourself? That is a difference that is born from everyday interactions and not some sort of grand, political shift at the national level.
I'm
I just
seeing
wanna make
reactions on
one-
the panel here. If you want to chime in.
I just want to
go
make
ahead.
one comment because I think first of all, I think it's critical. And there is this distinction that I think is really important that Mark brought up, that, in gay marriage, one of the key things was the number of people who had someone in their family, right? A son, a daughter, a cousin, an uncle, right? Which is very different than, coming and getting to know an immigrant and seeing, there's been a lot of great coverage about, factories where in the South, in the West, where, it had been an all-white, entirely white workforce that over time saw their children weren't coming into this job. There were, Latino immigrants coming into the job who were making less, and that instead of, getting to know each other and talking and finding out, hey, guess what? That we're not in conflict, we're in this together. Instead, there was this divide, and we're not talking together. And part of that was linguistic challenges. It was challenges across cultures. That is historically what we've seen in this country. But I wanted to build on something you guys were saying just really quick to talk about what do we mean by the middle. Because this is really critical, and I feel like sometimes is awfully lost, is what's a moderate? And so there was a great point I brought up earlier about the fact that we are more ideologically aligned with our political parties today. And so when I say what I don't think changed, that our neighbors were never that different from us, what I mean is, in the South, yes, it looks like they were voting for Democrats and Republicans, but they were ideologically aligned. They were just voting for different people, but they actually had, we used to have Democrats who were the Republicans of today, right? They were segregationists, they were, and that is no longer acceptable in the Democratic Party, right? You don't get to be that in the Democratic Party anymore.
That's not fair.
And
That's not fair.
but it's true. In the 1960s
That's
and
not fair.
70s. Wait. Let me finish.
It is in the Republican Party?
There were on both sides. So this is my point. So there were segregationists and anti-segregationists in both parties in the 1960s and 70s. There were pro-tax and anti-tax people in both parties. Now, there were people who are ideologically on those two ends, and what has happened today is over time they have picked their two parties or to be outside of the party system. But we are now really well aligned on if it's taxes, right? If you're pro-taxes, you're in the Democratic Party. If you're anti-taxes, you're in the Republican Party. But the same thing is true on, say, abortion. And we don't have a party that is, for example, pro-taxes and anti-abortion. But is that a moderate? That's two very different positions. It's not necessarily a moderate, right? It's not necessarily someone who's in the middle. So my point is not that one party is this and one party is that we have an ideological spectrum. So we've taken on cultural issues that divide the two parties, and we've taken on economic issues. Now, when we talk about moderates in political science, generally what we mean is people who are in the middle, who want some government and some taxes, but not tons of government and tons of taxes. And they want some social issues and not, right? They want maybe abortion to have some restrictions. It's not for everybody, but it's not illegal, right? So that would be our ideological moderate. But that's different than someone who holds positions in what we consider the two different political parties, which is what, as realignment has occurred, where we've seen, that's like the clearing out of those people who we used to have some, right, we still a couple, but we have more pro-choice Republicans and anti-choice Democrats, and we used to have those, and they would talk across the aisle to each other. And I think and I really wanted to build on this point that the population still has a lot of these people who are in the middle, but we've created these two parties that we're so well aligned with across issues that it's hard to find people who can get elected who are in both camps, what cross issues?
Mike, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond.
I actually don't think it's about issues. You know, we're talking about two things, polarization and civility. So issues come and go. They're very ephemeral. I think it's much more core. And I'll use the Donald Trump factor as an example. Now, I wasn't an original Trump fan. I was a Marco Rubio guy. But anyway, what we're seeing now, let's talk about the things that unify us and got us, the question, how do we get through it? I think in the end we got through it because we were all Americans. In the end, we loved our country. We respected religious rights. You know, in baseball, I'd hit a home run off a pitcher. I can remember two instances, or a guy would beam me in the head, and then we'd go out and have a beer after the game together, because we had a common love of baseball. So I think the things that unify us are really splitting apart right now, and that's love of country and fear of God. I love my country. I'm a patriot. I feel the far left does not love our country. I think they want to erase our history. I love our history as imperfect as it was. I don't want to erase from the books. I'm a Catholic. I believe in religious rights, but yet I see the far left want to infringe constantly on religious rights. There is nothing more core and fundamental than patriotism and faith in God. And those are being threatened. And when we defend those, and people who believe like I do, we're called deplorables or racists or bigots like I have been called, that really angers me. Now, I try not to act on that anger, but that's the emotion that's there. So it's emotion that drives incivility. And I think only those core fundamental issues. We were told 10 years ago we're going to fundamentally change this country. A lot of people like me didn't want to change it. And I think that's the emotion that's involved here that's driving the incivility on one side and the other.
Thank you. I have a question coming through on Twitter that I'm going to read. We keep hearing left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, yet there are other options and perspectives. However, the media largely ignores them. This is a question for Alan Rosenberg.
I won't speculate who that question's coming from. But the fact is that there are two large groups of people called Democratic and Republican parties that have a great deal of support in this country. And then there are other parties that time and time again put out candidates, and the voters don't choose those candidates. So as a medium with limited time, limited space, limited resources, which has always been the case, we can't do a giant story on every candidate when we know, because the polls are telling us so, and because everything we know about how politics functions is telling us so, that these people have zero chance not only of getting elected, but of pulling more than 1% of the electorate. So is there a self-fulfilling element to this? Maybe so. But when we have a certain number of reporters who have a certain number of days to cover an election, I don't think we can spend those days doing an in-depth story on each of 6 candidates for governor, for instance, that are on the ballot for the general election, when we know that there are 3, conceivably 4, but probably 3 and really 2 that have a chance of actually getting elected governor of the state of Rhode Island. So we want to tell you what those people stand for. We want to tell you where they agree and where they disagree, and what issues they're raising, and what they're saying about each other, and how that might reflect on their character. And not be distracted by doing a similar in-depth treatment of people who are never in a million years going to be the governor, and that time that is put into covering them in depth would be time that takes away from the actual choice that Rhode Islanders have.
We have another question. We have a lot of questions. I'm trying to get them in order here. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you all. This is great. So pretty much on a daily basis, the average citizen makes choices and decisions and actions around either self-interest or common good. I go to the grocery store, I buy my groceries, I make my choices on the way out, I make a contribution to the local soccer team. It's something we're all used to doing. In the area of self-interest, sometimes it's hard to find common ground. But in the area of common good, we're all used to doing that. Is it not the responsibility of public leaders and citizens and all of us to search for the small victories in the area of common ground and not wait for aliens to attack us so that we all unite?
Can I get in?
Go right ahead.
So first of all, I think one really important job of public leaders is to illuminate the ways in which self-interest and common good are the same, right? It's easy for us to forget that every day the things that allow us to run our lives, the streets, the streetlights, the sidewalks, the public parks, the public schools, like all of that is indeed part of government and something we are paying for with our tax dollars, and it supports all of us. And in fact, I think this is one of the things that is always frustrating to me when people talk about how self-made they are. Yeah, sure, some people have done very well for themselves, but nobody has done it in this country without the support of the kinds of systems and structures that exist and benefit all of us. And I want to respond a little bit to what Mike was saying earlier. So I do think we have a lot in common. We're all in the same community together. In lots of ways, we're all in this together. We all share the same government, and we maybe have competing views of what that ought to look like. But we share a community and we share a government. I strongly disagree with the characterization of the left as anti-patriotic. I'll just speak for myself. I don't know many people who don't, but that doesn't mean that we should deny or erase or fail to acknowledge and bring to the front some parts of its very troubling history and present. We have a country that has had, since its founding, and still has, systemic racism, systemic oppression of women, and all sorts of other kinds of groups of people. And to fight against that is not anti-patriotic, it is quite the opposite. And that is a deep faith of mine, and it has, in my own personal case, has very little to do with God. For many of my colleagues and compatriots in that work, it has a lot to do with God, so I don't think that the belief in God itself is unifying, but the belief that we are one community and we should find a way to live together fairly and justly, I do think that that's unifying, and we might have differing visions of it, but I hope we all share that.
Dr. Merryweather, I want to ask you, in your role, both at Rhode Island College now, but also in other universities, this idea of finding common ground, is that a common value on campuses? And is there a way that higher ed is even nurturing that type of exploration?
I would say in many institutions that isn't expressed and for the most part live value. Certainly it is at Rick. But you do see different iterations of that. As an example, so I'm a Rhode Islander because I live here. My family is here, my wife and children are here, I pay taxes here, and I love the restaurants. I'm a Rhode Islander.
If you notice his accent, he's from southern Rhode Island.
However, interestingly enough, I am from Kentucky. You can certainly hear that in my accent. But I'll throw something out at you. So I am, being from Kentucky, I grew up a Baptist. Grew up in a very small church with a few families, a pastor. We used to do mission trips and benevolence work. And by definition, I am an evangelical Christian. Collective gasp. But by definition, I am an evangelical Christian because we certainly did some evangelizing in my growing up in Kentucky. But that has now become a political construct. So if I say that, how can I, with my hue, I work on a college campus, surely I must be a fleeting liberal. And so with that in mind, what I actually am through growing up where I come from, that's now become so politicized that sometimes it's sort of, I hunt and I fish, because I grew up in the South, and that's an interesting thing. But from a perspective, what does that mean? Does that now mean, oh, because you do this thing, do you necessarily subscribe to all these values? So with that in mind, if a student comes into my office, you know, when I was in Indiana, if a student came to my office with a rebel flag on his shirt, guess what? My job was to help him or her and support them. If a student comes in with a Barack Obama shirt or a Black Lives Matter shirt, guess what? My job is to help them and support them and get them through a dialectic process and engage in discourse. And I think that college campuses have also become politicized, because I know plenty of very conservative and ultra-liberal professors and faculty at a number of campuses across the country. But the college experience, you know, we're at this point where people, oh, well, science, forget that you've spent like 30 years in school and you've done all this research and you've been to the moon. That's just not true. Forget science, it's just not true, because it's become politicized. And so the real work on campuses and our mission around commonality is to respect and embrace and value people and their different ideas and traditions and mores and points of view and beliefs, and to allow people to simply be who they are. I've done some research. There have been 1,300 incidents reported of hate crimes on 775 college campuses in the last couple of years. The top hits, 40% of them have been based on race, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, and disability, in that order of occurrence and frequency among those hate crimes. So that's happening on our campuses, and we know, people show up with these flyers. You have the speakers from the right, speakers from the left. People want to disqualify all sorts of points of view. But if students aren't going to learn that here, where are they going to learn it? The K-12 mission has opportunity for learning engagement, but certainly the college mission does. So I do believe it's in the mission of most institutions and in the practice of most institutions. But the challenge is, do we actually live to and espouse that? And I think that's what's a little bit troubling. One of our awesome students, Lucy, asked this question of sort of around demagoguery. And in reality, we'll take a selfie after this, okay? but there's this, remember that song, the 80s song, Cult of Personality? I think it's late 80s, early 90s, Cult of Personality song. And that sort of happens where we shift into these big personalities and these big ideas and away from these big concepts and these glittery phrases, but away from ideas. And so the college campus is supposed to be driving people, and again, we work really hard at this at RIC every day, to drive people into discourse, that it is okay to let someone say they believe something you don't believe. One of my best friends from high school, Heath Shimwell, we've been fighting about politics since we were 4 years old, and we're both almost 40. And we fight about it all the time. I love going home and we argue about politics, but then we can have a drink and we can have fun and we can talk and we can laugh and talk about our families. And we have these things that unify us, and that ability has been lost. So colleges have to shape that. We have to shape intellectual curiosity, not intellectual blockades.
I'm sorry, Alan, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to these excellent remarks there, because I think there's a big danger to the social fabric of this country in what people assume about large groups of other people. When I first became executive editor at the Journal, I wrote a column kind of laying out who I was, and I mentioned that I thought it was a problem for the news media that the president viewed us as the enemies of the people. And I immediately heard from readers who said, well, obviously you're a communist. Obviously you're a liberal. You've shown your true colors. And I wrote back and said, it is a problem for us that the president thinks these things about us. When we announced the panel here, I heard from people who said, well, you've got all liberals on the panel. And I said, well, what do you mean? Who are you talking about? And they said, well, you've got Georgia, and you've got all these academics. And I said, well, how do you know what their politics are? And they said, well, they teach at a college, so they're liberals. And when I said, well, that seems like a pretty big assumption, one of them, to her credit, said, yes, it is, and expressed interest in coming here tonight. But there's an assumption. There are assumptions on the left as well about what, what the plurals might be and what they all think and what they cling to. And these are really dangerous things to have in our heads in place of meeting people, in place of talking to people and hearing what they have to say. And I see a lot, I see a lot of things trickling through my email because I hear from a lot of not political elites, but regular people who are writing to comment on something we've written or haven't written or put on the front page or haven't put on the front page. And there is just anger and distrust and assumption. And the assumption is that we're putting our thumb on the scale one way or another for whatever it is that that person doesn't agree with. And I think, Mark was talking about talking to people face to face. Somehow we've got to get past the assumptions that we have about people to the people.
Yeah, but, Ted, you don't have time for all this nuance. When you're doing the news or you're doing political debate, you got to have some labels, you got to categorize this thing, you got to get that concise. Is there any room or ability to have political debate without labels?
I'm not against labels. I think people are busy. I see part of my job, I'm lucky enough to get paid to gather information and learn about politics or the economy, whatever I'm covering that day. And my job is to go back and literally report to people who have kids to take to soccer and a 9-to-5 job or maybe 2 jobs or whatever it is. Here's the most concise summary I can give you of why this is important, how it happened, and who the people involved are. And if it's only labels, and especially if they're glib labels or unfair labels, that's a problem. But on the other hand, saying someone is a Democrat or a Republican is an important data point for a voter who may feel strongly that way. Most voters in the end lean one way or the other. So, I think the trick is to try to, I saw someone say, there's too much, I think it's there, no, a different one. It said about, we're talking so much about Democrats and Republicans. Well, actually, I see some reps in the audience. As a Rhode Island political reporter, I mostly cover Democrats versus Democrats. And I mean, you see sometimes more ideological gap between the different Democrats at the State House than you do with the Republicans. You don't know. And then on the other hand, you had every single Democrat and Republican lawmaker voted for the state budget just a few years ago. So I think, labels matter, but of course they can't be the end of the story, which is why, as someone who switched from newspapers to TV, it's nice that we have websites now. We can say at the end of a short TV report, go online for more. And, for Alan's team, they can do something longer. They can go interactive past what they can do in print and still use the base of print. So I don't mean to be long-winded, but I think there is a place for labels, but I think that can't be the end of it, certainly, for journalists.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. I have another audience question. Yes, sir.
My name is Eric Pearson. I'm from Richmond. I'm a literate wood chopper from Richmond. And my question or my comment is that I believe we're dealing with this high degree of polarization because we're dealing with issues that are very, very divisive and in some cases maybe irreconcilable. And so my perspective there is that, and the reason for that is that we've lost or have very little moral consensus anymore. I'd like to direct or ask the opinion of Dr. Merryweather on this concept of we've lost a moral consensus.
Eric, thank you for that question. I kind of go back to what I said earlier. I think the politicizing of certain topics have really pushed us away from even having some of those conversations. I mean, at the end of the day, I'll use Rick as an example. Rick really is reflective of the experience walking through the mall, what you see walking our campus. Our diversity is visible. It's there in a number of ways. If you speak with students and talk with students and really listen to their stories, there's still some sincere commonalities. Almost 80% of our students work, and about 60% of them are working to support their families, not even pay for college first, but to support their families. I think you could equate that to a moral position that, you know, they're going to college, they're working, they're supporting their families. The earning these degrees really lead to sort of a generational change for families. And I think if you really drill that down, that really is a moral issue. It's responsibility, it's care and love for one another. If there's a faith or religious aspect to it, all of those things matter. And I really think across the right or across the left, it's very difficult to really see the difference in that. And if you really talk to people and listen to their stories, and that's the beauty of my job and Dr. Brophy Berman, outside the teaching and the programming and the education, we get to really listen to these young people's stories and these adult student stories. And I think that the ability to give them those spaces on a college campus to simply be who they are and exist, people are simply fighting to survive. They're fighting to be heard. Whether we want to accept it or not, there has been substantive, historical, systematic oppression among a number of groups. And one of the things living in Indiana and growing up in Kentucky has certainly taught me is that doesn't always have a hue. You know, I could tell you counties in Indiana that I went to when I worked there that were 0% non-white census and considerable amounts of poverty. And, you know, and the funny thing is sometimes I'd be like the most comfortable one going there. And I say all that to say that if we really dig down deeply and we talk to people, sort of to your point earlier, if you really dig down deeply, it's giving people an opportunity to share their stories. And then saying, okay, we've got that, we understand who you are, you have a place, now you're free to learn. Because there is a huge impediment to learning if we're not able to simply feel safe or feel that we belong. And that is across race, that is across ethnicity. I went down the list of the hate crimes. Everyone's getting hit. So I say all that to say it's really in the stories that people bring and listening to them. And then sure enough, kind of like me and my buddy Heath I talked about earlier, you can get past some of this divisive, corrosive political context.
We have another question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Luis Daniel Munoz, Central Falls High School graduate, Rhode Island College, graduate medical doctor and independent candidate for governor of Rhode Island. Ballot certified as well, just to inform the audience. My question relates to media, special interests, and the parties and hyperpolarization that we currently see in Rhode Island. As a candidate for governor, not discounting what was said about interviews and newscasts, we've currently had one debate and have an upcoming debate for the gubernatorial candidates with selective exclusion of some of the candidates. And my question is, how does that contribute or not to the hyperpolarization we're seeing when we're omitting the many diverse ideas that candidates are proposing to try to mitigate some of the hyperpolarization that we're seeing across the country and here in Rhode Island? Thank you.
It looks like that's either Alan or Ted, probably, for starters.
Well, we're sponsoring the upcoming debate, so I'll answer that. We've looked for your positions, Dr. Munoz, and we don't see where you've put them out. We haven't received position papers from you. We haven't received press releases from you. We haven't received any indication you're holding events. We haven't received any indication that you're actually actively campaigning. And so to then say, well, I'm on the ballot, I should be in this debate. You're on the ballot, but your campaign, as far as we can tell, and maybe we're not looking in the right places, it's on your website. That doesn't, in all due respect, that does not constitute a campaign. I've seen your Facebook page. You absolutely have a Facebook page and you post to it frequently. That's not a campaign. It's certainly not a campaign that will ever get you elected governor in this election. And so for us to include you in a debate and take time away from candidates who the voters could actually end up selecting for governor because they have been running a campaign, they have been issuing positions, they have been holding events, I think really does a disservice to the people because it takes time that they could be listening to the candidates who could win and gives it to someone who is not really running an active campaign that's putting ideas out into the marketplace of ideas.
I have a feeling someone's going to get a lot of mail soon. Yes, please. Yes, you have a question. I hold it.
All right. So I'll keep this because, like, those I'm very long-winded too. I guess first I want to say thank you,
I'm a Leadership Rhode Island alum, also Rhode Island College graduate as well. Yeah. So I guess first, thank you for running for governor, first of all. As a fellow millennial, hate that word, I want to give you credit. I mean, I understand, sir, in all due respect, like the traditional way of running for election. But, for example, let's look at President Obama. He came from nowhere, and he was very grassroots, and he won twice, not just one time, twice. So, and even as I don't like the man, we got to give Donald Trump some credit, because it kind of was like left field himself.
Stephanie, what's your question?
So, I guess my question is, one will be in terms of bringing up the millennial vote, because honestly, it was kind of like with the primaries. I was a poll worker. I didn't see, especially of my age group, voting, so that's number one. So that's number one, how to engage my age group, because we're very different. And then even going for the 18-year-olds, like my brother's 17, he's about to graduate, and when we had that discussion about politics, he was like, they don't really care. And he goes to a Providence public school, so that's another issue too. They don't really care. So that's one of the things. And then the second thing, to go to, I forgot his name, earlier, 2 points about, I guess, being cross-culturally, like being on both sides. As a first generation immigrant, my parents are from Africa, so I've been through, I guess they've been through a lot. They've seen a lot in this country. So I guess to point that, you know, my family's also very religious as well. So I have that background, but I guess also...
What's your question, Stephanie?
Okay, so my question one is to, how would you say to relate to my age group in terms of the goal? Because it's different. We don't engage the traditional...
So you folks at Rhode Island College, how are younger people engaging with the process, and what do you do to encourage this type of engagement if you do something?
Well, I would just say we know that 18 to 25-year-olds have the lowest voter turnout record, and that's been like that for pretty much forever. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, one, they don't have a habit of voting, and voting can be intimidating the very first time around. Two, they oftentimes don't think that issues matter to them. Although there are all kinds of issues that matter to them, they don't see it. Three, what's going on in the schools? I mean, besides doing a mock election when you're in 4th grade or whatever, are students really being taught to think about the importance of their voice and what does impact them? So I think the problem is, I mean, we try to do things to get students involved and get students to vote. There are certain types of, the fact is, students who are more partisan, people who are more partisan, they're more likely to vote. People who are independents are less likely to vote, especially if they don't lean one way or the other. And a lot of young people, rightly so, they're growing up, maybe their parents were Republicans or Democrats, but they're coming of age and they're like, I don't really know who I am. So they're not as connected to the party. So it's not an easy answer, but I think exciting candidates will definitely help people out to bring people out to vote, certainly.
I would also say from a very strategic place, and I'll be very brief, a lot of our work is to also educate students sort of about the process. There's really no better place than in a classroom when faculty are having those conversations about the electoral process and about civic engagement through service projects, through registration campaigns. You know, we had lots of opportunities for students to be able to register to vote right here on campus. I've done that at other institutions. And I think that to Dr. Brophy Berman's point, it really is saying that there's a place for individuals in the process. And I think that there really is sort of a disconnect that as a young person I have some place. Really interesting with this generation. I don't think they're a cursed or lost generation by any means. I think there's a lot of awesome potential in this generation, and they actually have more service hours and more activism than generations past. The challenge is, how do we frame that to actually getting into the voting booth? And that's really the work that sometimes there's this concept, oh, well, if I serve, if I give my time, if I tutor, that's me being active, but that's only one part of engagement. And so it's teaching those lessons about actually being connected to that important aspect of the civic process?
I actually am a millennial, and I would just say, you know, one way for more millennials to vote would be for more millennials to go vote. You know, like, I just think sometimes our generation can be a little too waiting for someone to come, you know, give us a new version of something that's been done for a long time. You know, we have the right to vote when we turn 18 as millennials, and so we should exercise it. And yes, of course, if people don't realize that, or if campaigns aren't strategically talking to them, that stuff does matter. But at the same time, I think it's also incumbent on millennials to take some responsibility for themselves, and if they care about the future of their state, their country, their city or town, show up.
Interesting point. This generation has never known inconvenience.
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah.
You know, to Ted's point, I'm serious. Think about it. This generation has never known the inconveniences. You know, they've never walked, you know, 20 miles to school uphill both ways. And from that point of view, it really is incumbent upon us. I agree with Ted, but I just also would add to that it's our work to really say, okay, this isn't as simple. You know, you can't vote on an app. You just can't. And so as educators, it is our job to frame that process and their role in the process and how that really works. And I think we're failing students if we don't.
Yeah, Dr. Merryweather, I got to say, just last week, my Facebook automatically logged me off, and I had to log on again. I mean, this is not, it's not all peaches and cream over here, okay? I'm just saying. So let's move on to these eye clickers. You still got those eye clickers in your hands? Get them out, get them out. All right, so our first question. It's a little bit deja vu, maybe. Who is to blame for the red-blue divide? A, the voters, B, the parties, C, special interests, D, the media. They didn't give you that choice. Got 84 of you. Did we lose that many? Mark, that one answer was kind of long-winded. They just, yeah. All right, we're up to 88. Last call. All right, let's see what we got here. Parties. 34% parties. Final question for the evening. Is political polarization good or bad for America? A, very good. B, somewhat good. C, neither good nor bad. D, somewhat bad. E, very bad. "91 of you this time. 92. Some people are waking up. This is good. All right, let's see what we got. Uh-oh, we have some shift. So I encourage you to pick up the Providence Journal tomorrow, read all about it, extra, extra. And I just want to thank all our panelists for sharing their knowledge and experience with us tonight. Thank you for caring, for coming out, for sharing your opinions, asking questions. This is how democracy works. You got to get in a room. You got to know each other. Know your neighbors, as Mark Dunkelman said. And a shameless plug. On October 13th, Saturday, at the Veterans Memorial Auditorium, there will be a TEDx Providence. At that, I'm going to share my perspective on what I think we can all do to decrease polarization across America. So hopefully I'll see you there. If you buy a ticket today, just because we're talking polarization, it's half price. So TEDx Providence, October 13th. We'll see you at the next Publick Occurances, though, okay?